Welcome. My name is Gunther Peck. I'm the director of the program, and I am absolutely delighted to be part of this conversation today and to be part of this wonderful conference that Paulus has organized, Reimagining the Vote. And before we go any further, I want to thank Professor Deandra Rose for her extraordinary vision, collaboration. It's been really fun to put this panel and the next panel that has students on it Thursday together. So what I'm going to do briefly is just say a little bit about the idea of this panel, how it came into being. I'll introduce the students and then introduce the moderator, who is also a student. So we are in our democracy at this moment looking at several things that seem to be in tension. One is a kind of clear example of how democracy seems to be failing us. The barriers to voting are profound. The aspirations we have for democracy run headlong into many of the barriers that we experience, that we see. And part of what is exciting about that conflict is that, in fact, it creates the opportunity to think through problems, to see them, and then to find solutions. So what I'm really excited about today is to hear from some really remarkable students who have been considering up close the powerful structural barriers to voting, and then also in relationship with community partners that they've worked with through the Hart Leadership Program, have found ways to think through what are some of the solutions, or at least possible solutions, the places to start in making democracy really what we want it to be, reimagining our democracy. This idea that idealism is here and pragmatism is over here. In fact, both can happen, they can nurture each other, and I think all three of the presentations today show that in spades. So I'm going to be, I'll present to you, introduce the names of the students who are going to be presenting, and our wonderful moderator, all of them students, all of them we are proud to be connected with in Sanford and through Paulus, and also in the Hart Leadership Program. Carlee Goldberg will speak first on the topic of voting rights for Native Americans, a 2020 Service Opportunity and Leadership Soul Fellow. Carlee is a junior from Parkland, Florida, and a political science and history major. She is also an A.B. Duke Scholar and serves as a Duke Student Government Justice. Her research interests are at the intersection of juvenile justice and gun violence. Outside of Duke, Carlee serves as the director of the Triangle Debate League, an organization aimed at increasing access to speech and debate opportunities in the Triangle area. For her Summer Sold project, Carlee worked with the U.S. Department of Justice's Voting Rights Division and conducted research on voting barriers facing Indigenous communities. After Carlee, she'll hear from her shortly. After Carlee, we will hear from Ana Ramirez, who graduated from Duke in 2020, the BA in Environmental Science and Policy, a double major in Religious Studies, and a certificate in Latino Studies in the Global South. During her time at Duke, Ana was a Rubenstein Merit Scholar and a Mellon Mays Research Fellow. She also co-founded Duke Define American, a terrific immigrant student advocacy group, and was co-president of Mi Gente, Duke's Latinx Student Association. She is currently the Associate in Research for the Hart Leadership Program, and I'm so glad to be able to work with Ana every day. She's worked closely with the Elections in a Pandemic Bass Connections team this semester that you'll hear about, and is looking forward to seeing the amazing students work together. She'll be followed as part of the same team, Axel Herrera Ramos, who graduated with a BS in Economics and a double major in Sociology in the spring of 2020. During his time at Duke, Axel co-founded the Duke Define American chapter. He served also on Mi Gente's executive board and worked as a resident assistant. He currently holds a service position in Sampson County as part of the Duke College Advising Corps. His service work has extended to promoting voting across access within the Latinx and Spanish-speaking populations of North Carolina through the work of Poder NC Action and Votemos North Carolina. Axel is, we're so glad to have you. They will be followed, and they will be speaking about language barriers for Hispanic citizens in North Carolina, finding the cure. And the final group is two students as well, a team, Thea Dowrich and Sydney McKinney, and they're going to be speaking about voting rights for North Carolina's formerly incarcerated citizens. Sydney will begin and is also majoring in public policy and German, double major. Every one of these students seems to be doing that. She's originally from Atlanta, Georgia, plans to either pursue a career on the Hill or to attend law school. On campus, she has served as a student journalist for the Duke Reporters Lab, a member of the club soccer team, political action committee chair of the Duke NAACP, is a team leader of the Duke Community Consulting. Last summer, she worked as a sales and trading analyst at Bank of America, Merrill Lynch in New York. She is also a Peck Fellow, Political Engagement Project, part of our inaugural class that we are hosting with Paulus. Thea Dowrich will be next and is a public policy major with double minor in chemistry and statistical science. She's originally from Bridgetown, Barbados, and previously lived in Connecticut before relocating to Tokyo, Japan. At Duke, she is a camp counselor through Duke's chapter of Camp Kasim, a teaching assistant in the statistical science department, and volunteers at Step Up Durham off campus. They also participated in a Basque Connections project about expressive writing for resilience. This past summer, she interned at Civics Analytics as an applied data scientist on their government team, and is also a political engagement project fellow. Our moderator, I'm glad to say, is another student of mine, Lauren Howell, who is the RDU chapter president of North Carolina Building Our Revolution Now. Lauren is a senior at Duke, majoring in public policy and minoring in education and visual media studies. After a year-long internship with the U.S. House of Representatives, she was driven to engage with the Hart Leadership's project's Why Vote competition, encouraging her peers to enact the democracy they wished to see. She continued this work in her internship with the Democracy Lab, urging Raleigh constituents to demand change with their voices and their votes. She currently serves as RDU chapter president of NC Building a Revolution Now, and has organized numerous Black Lives Matter protests in her hometown of Raleigh, North Carolina, demanding justice for those murdered by Raleigh Police Department officials. She is a force. I'm so glad that Lauren, I'm going to hand it over to you. And if you wanted to begin with a few words of your own reflecting on the theme of this panel, which is simply institutional barriers to the vote and potential solutions.
Thank you for that introduction. I'm really excited to be here amongst you all and to hear you speak more about your work. I've had the opportunity, like Professor Peck said, to participate in a lot of action in Raleigh, North Carolina, and as a result have seen the frustration at the institutional barriers that young people face, especially in voting, along racial lines. So excited for y'all to tackle that more. Sydney and Thea, I also have done work with Emancipate NC, which works with formerly incarcerated persons. So it's definitely something I would love to hear about. And Axel was on the Hill at the same time as me, wonderful inspiration, as well as Anna. So I'm excited to hear from y'all as well. And with that, I won't talk too much more about myself, and I'll just hand it over to Carlee.
Carlee, you need to unmute.
Okay, great. Can you all see me?
No, you need to you also open your video.
Okay, it says the host has, there we go. All right, awesome. Hello, everyone. I am so excited to be here. This past summer, I was working with the Department of Justice in their voting section, whose job is to enforce federal laws and statutes that ensure that every citizen has the right to vote, While I was working there, the Native American Rights Foundation published a comprehensive report looking at the barriers facing Native American voters. My research really focused on the barriers that COVID-19 is going to present to them, in addition to what the barriers that already exist are going to do. So just the background of it, and if there's one thing you really get out of my presentation, it should be this, that the state of Native American voting was in crisis, and that was before you threw a global pandemic at it. Unfortunately, what we're looking at is that the problem with COVID-19 is the solutions that we're gonna have to implement in order to ensure the election is safe and is efficient may end up disproportionately harming Native American voters if we're not careful. So just some background on Native American voting and just where the barriers were before we hit COVID. Essentially, there were issues from the point you register until the point you cast the ballot. So in order to register, you need 3 key things. You need a valid address, you need an ID, and you need some way to actually register to vote. So whether that's online, whether that's in person. And unfortunately, those seem like very simple areas to do. They're not. So within Native American communities, unfortunately, about 1/3 of them actually live in what is considered hard to trace areas, meaning that they are very rural, which means it's extremely difficult to get consistent mail, to get consistent coverage, and just makes in general transportation and very general communication difficult. Additionally, we have a disproportionate number of Native Americans facing either economic instability, overcrowding, or some other form of housing crisis and instability, meaning that we don't have consistent housing available to list that address. And then finally, you have a disproportionate number living in what are called non-traditional addresses, meaning that instead of our typical 123 Main Street address, they use some other reference point or landmark, which makes it really difficult to A, confirm they're in the right place to register, and then B, put them in the right district to vote. Additionally, people tend to be very far from driver's license sites, from the DMVs, from postal work and UPS places, which means it's really difficult in general just to acquire the documents to prove where you can vote. I'll give you an example. In North Dakota, there's about 26 driver's license sites in a county of 56, meaning that in a lot of those cases, actually only 12 of them are open 1 day a month for under 6 hours, which you can imagine is extremely difficult in order to arrange your schedule around those days. Additionally, lack of transportation tends to follow a lot of those issues where you have economic instability or poverty rates, meaning that even traveling 20 or 30 or 40 miles is in many cases unfeasible. Additionally, once you've registered to vote, you then have to figure out how to cast a ballot. In a lot of areas, the resources when you have a mail-in ballot mean you don't get access to language assistance, to accessibility issues such as hearing or vision, which means for many people, it's very necessary for them to vote either in person or even just because of the distance, just convenient or more trustworthy to do so in an actual polling place, especially in states where they're either mandating you mail in a ballot or where they're lowering the amount of polling sites. You have people who are now going to have to travel very far distances to reach a polling site. In some cases, that can be 140 miles from their community to the site one way. Additionally, you have a lot of issues when you have a mail-in ballot, sending it in as well as receiving it. Because you don't have a non-traditional address, you tend to not get mail delivered directly to your home, meaning you are going to usually have to use a postal service or a PO box in order to get mail. The issue with that, it's expensive to own a PO box. There's a limited amount, and those are too fairly located far away from where you live, meaning you're going to have to go out of your way to really get mail, which means you might not collect it every day. So once you get your ballot, which could be delayed, you then have to send it back in. And the way it works in a lot of rural places is the postal route doesn't necessarily follow logic. So in some areas, it may actually have to leave your state. So you may cast a ballot, you may live in Utah, cast the ballot, it will travel to Arizona before going back to your county place to be counted, which is problematic if you have a state that requires ballots to be in by a certain day or postmarked by a certain day. So once you have considered those barriers, you then realize that the issue is the reasons that make it so disproportionately hard to vote for Native Americans are the same issues that make it disproportionately more dangerous for those communities to contract COVID. So when you look at what the states have tried to implement in order to make these elections safer, you are dealing with some of the bigger issues and concerns. So the biggest one has to do with converting to an all-mail ballot. So traditionally, and let me just say, increasing access to mail-in ballots is fantastic. It's great. It is probably one of the better solutions we have to cope. But unfortunately, when you mandate it, as is the case of 9 states right now, you've prevented many people from getting the easiest access to the polling places. Because what ends up happening, again, is they don't have the direct mail that goes to their homes in many cases, meaning that you're going to have to interact with someone in that community, whether it's the postal worker, whether it's the person who brings you your mail in order to receive your ballot. Once you have that, you then have to work around both the travel time to maybe pick up your ballot and when it's going to be open, as well as try to factor in when your ballot will get there, meaning you're going to have a very short window to ensure that your ballot will be counted. The other 2 issues you're facing is you're consolidating polling places because either they're in locations that are just not suitable because you can't do social distancing, or because they're in communities that are very high risk. And you're also dealing with a reduction in poll workers. In the US, the average poll workers between 65 and 70, also a very high risk of poll worker groups. So you have less people able to staff it. When that happens, you see communities and counties starting to crack down on the amount, and they're going to leave the ones that are open in the very high population areas. So that's usually the county capital, that's the clerk's office, which again are usually located off or away from the tribal communities, which just further complicates the issue. So you have more people in one location, you have longer wait times, and you're also just dealing with people who just don't have traditional means of access to get to either a mail-in ballot or to now get to the few remaining polling sites. So then the issue is, how do we solve this issue? The problem is there's not really an easy fix. I really wish we could wave a magic wand and say, if we all do mail-in, we'll all be fine. As I said, it's just not going to be the case. But I think the first step really is addressing how people perceive elections. So Native Americans can sway the vote in both party directions. In any case, this isn't a partisan issue. It's a matter of people need to vote, and the issues they face are very unique and need to be addressed in order to ensure that people have the right to vote. That's especially important for North Carolina, who is one of the biggest populations of Native Americans east of the Mississippi. So this isn't a perception of this happens somewhere far away, or this is a very little impact to you, because this is happening in our own state. Additionally, I think a lot of it also has to do with how we are choosing to see how elections are going to be run. We have a very big issue in that once election day comes, we want to know who won as fast as possible. We want, in general, to have the election called that night. With the way the election's going to run now, with so many people either relying on or having to rely on mail-in ballots, it's going to take longer in general. So a lot of people get frustrated when their state is trying to pass laws or is announcing that they're going to extend the days they accept ballots to maybe 2 weeks after. But the reason they're doing that is to ensure people who are living in Utah, ballots get counted because it took the long way around and went out of state, even though they sent it in on time. Additionally, it's really an accountability for our election officers. The way elections are run, it's at the municipal or county level. So they're the ones deciding where the funding goes, who gets the sites, what limited resources are available. So we really need to hold whoever our election officers in charge of ensuring that Native American community representatives are helping make those decisions, are helping ensure that the policies that would make it almost impossible for them to vote are taken into account and reflecting of the population who needs to vote. And then finally, volunteering is a great opportunity as well, whether it's working with a group that works on Native American voting rights, such as Native Vote or 4 Directions that operates in North Carolina, or even just volunteering as a poll worker to ensure that there's enough sites on hand. So those are the solutions. Like Professor Peck said, those are a start, but those are ones we actively need to consider. So that was my presentation. I'd be happy to answer questions at the end of the panel, but I'm going to pass the torch on to Ana Ramirez and Axel Herrera on their presentation on language barriers for Hispanic citizens.
Thank you, Carlee. Hi, everyone. So this pandemic has forced us to think about whose voices will or won't be heard in this election cycle. And one of the biggest issues facing voting rights is language barriers. Are we ensuring that Spanish-speaking citizens have the resources that they need to be able to vote? In class one day, we were chatting with this amazing lawyer, her name's Yael Bromberg, when we found out, much to all of our surprises, that while you can register to vote in Spanish, while you can request an absentee ballot in Spanish, the actual ballot and the instructions to fill it out are only in English in the state of North Carolina. And that's quite a contradiction and a big issue. Think about our Hispanic community who want to exercise their right, their privilege to vote, but might not know how to navigate the ballot in English. Or think about those who might not know how to request their ballot or don't know that voting in person early is an option or where their nearest polling site is. What are we doing to address these language barrier issues in North Carolina during this crucial election? So this past summer, Professor Peck co-led a summer project called Elections in a Pandemic. And the premise of it was students investigating democracy issues related or being affected by COVID-19. A lot of great work came out during that summer, and building on that research, we are currently running a Basque Connections project with the same name, Elections in a Pandemic, that is investigating the challenges that the coronavirus outbreak poses to democratic electoral process related to voting rights and voting turnout. So as part of our Basque Connections project, we have 2 student teams tackling the issues of language barriers. Part of our work with the students is connecting them to a community organization that is doing important work that we can further amplify and support. And we are so lucky to be working with an organization called Poder and See Action as our partner for this particular project. They are an organization that does civic and leadership development within the Latinx community in the state of North Carolina. They're currently doing some fantastic work regarding voter outreach and voting rights with the Latinx community. Definitely make sure to check out their organization. I went on their website, I found some contact information, and I introduced myself via email to their People Power Director. Her name is Eliana Santillan. And I explained the idea of our project and how we wanted to support the work that they were already doing and provide some student power. And she was thankfully more than happy to collaborate with us. And we've been doing some great work with her and with Axel Herrera Ramos, who is working directly with Poder and See Action and their Votemos and See effort. So in partnership with Poder and See Action, our first student team, Jeremy and Shirley, are crafting informational social media messages aimed at Latinx youth to help empower and educate Spanish-speaking voters, while Adam and Garrett are investigating issues involving Spanish language absentee balloting and translation. So Axel has been working directly with both our student groups, serving as their advisor throughout this whole process. He's going to elaborate a little bit more on his work with Poder and See Action, the issue of language barrier within the Latinx community, specifically in North Carolina, and our student groups. Axel?
Great, thank you so much. And appreciate the intro of what the groups are already doing because it makes my job easier. And really how I come into this is really kind of like a bridge, right? Being a recently graduated student and now wanting to engage solely within the community. You know, there's a lot of resources that we have on campus, and these students doing this great work through Basque Connections is one of them, right? So I wanted to make sure that we were trying to plug into work that was already doing and chip in my own efforts as well. So as it pertains to voting and democracy, influx of newcomer Spanish-speaking immigrants in North Carolina has brought like a lot of different debates, mostly about the conditions and the experiences of the Latinx population, but not on how to engage them in this democratic process. Because largely they were, or some still are, not allowed to participate in that democracy. And so some of these challenges have a lot to do with language barriers that exist within the community, but also larger, broader issues of trust that a lot of times undermine the confidence that this community has in that democratic process, or having not been able to participate beforehand. So if you hear the term language barrier, you may think pretty easily you're like immigrants, maybe trying to navigate the US system. But the truth is that the Latinx population or Hispanic population within the state is actually majority citizen. The majority are citizens, and of those that are naturalized citizens who are older, you actually find a higher rate of like them having issues with languages that provide obstacles on how to vote, on having appropriate information to them that's accessible in their language. And then also just, a history of fear and engaging with government institutions. Whereas with the younger Latinx population, the challenges becomes less about language and then more about what the effects of the history of disenfranchisement of their families or the communities results in their own experience with, engaging with voting and democracy. Why that's relevant is because in the state, about a little over 9 in 10 Latinx youth under the age of 18 who will, who are US born citizens and will be able to vote, are not being engaged in the appropriate way. So like over 90% of them are citizens, but they haven't had parents or siblings who have had access to the ballot. And the question is, how do we empower them to engage in this political process? So I kind of wanted to set that scene and then kind of go into how, the challenges affect these two different generations. The first one being this older, mostly foreign born or nationalized citizen, and then the other one being and having language barriers. So like Anna mentioned, there's various aspects where this plays out. One of the main ones is in terms of voter registration, right? Online registration tools are not all provided in Spanish. They are largely, the state is not required to provide them in a translated manner as well. And tools like the online registration tools from the DMV or the ability to track your ballot online is not in Spanish. And so those are big cliffs that we have when people are actually trying to go through this process. Like she mentioned, in terms of the groups that we have working on ballots, those themselves, people can request them in Spanish, and when they get them, they're essentially in English and their instructions are in English as well. So that's another gap for those who are not as bilingual or have the English capacity. And lastly, I think this one is super important, is candidate information. Besides presidential, governor, or congressional campaigns, there may not be enough resources or genuine interest for down ballot campaigns to mobilize and provide some outreach to Latinx speaking, Spanish speaking voters. And that's super relevant when it comes to issues that are much more closely impactful for Latinx individuals or communities in general, meaning education, housing, healthcare, that are decided at the local level. So that's kind of like an overview of the challenges for those older Latinx voters. And for the younger ones, you find that ironically, one, they're at a higher rate US citizens and have access to the ballot. They're younger, they're bilingual, but it's almost as if they were first generation college students. They haven't had someone go through that process. And I use the analogy because it can highlight just how like fuzzy the process can be and how like not having had someone go before you can really impact you. So what we require is adequate messaging on to engage with them on the reasons and motivation as to why they should vote. Simple things about how to register to vote, where to vote, things that all voters essentially always need reminders of. And they're essentially basic, but a lot of those small hurdles can really add up and discourage some of these young voters from like engaging for the first time. So real quickly, some of the solutions that Poder and Votemos has been working on is how to provide that access, right? And so votemosnc.com is really a collaboration of several organizations. It is a bilingual space for Latinx community to get information about the 2020 election, the electoral process, and hopefully future elections to come. North Carolina as a state really has a lot of great organizations that serve the Latinx community. And Votemos is really more of a platform where we can accumulate our efforts and be able to like centralize some of this information that we're trying to provide. The site includes bilingual tools on and information on voter registration, polling sites, deadlines, and then what I mentioned about candidates and election center where they can get more informed on their specific ballots and the candidates on their site. So that's what we're trying to push through these community groups with the work that the Bass Connection is doing by providing translation and resources that allows people to understand, like, what do these different, positions on my ballot mean, and where could I get a sample ballot? Those questions, and just putting those resources out there on like physical copies, but also digital formats. And in terms of the youth opportunity that we have, there's an amazing opportunity that exists with that subgroup of Latinx bilingual youth. And there's very highly engaged and energized groups of those that some of the Votemos community organizations are already mobilizing. And so our Bass Connection really is trying to tap into this incredible asset to make sure that we are using those social media tools to engage with them in a localized manners that allows us to distribute and uplift some of the resources that we have through Votemos NC. So in summary, the challenge is really how to bring new Americans who have been here for probably decades now, but we're naturalized citizens, and young Americans who are children of immigrants or immigrants themselves into this democratic process in a way that affirms their right to participate and provides bilingual and culturally competent resources for them to do so. So that's kind of what we want to share. And then to follow up next, we have Thea and Sydney talking about voting rights for North Carolina's formerly incarcerated citizens.
Yeah, thank you so much, Axel, for that introduction. My partner, Thea, is caught up in a test right now, but may pop in to talk a little bit. If not, then I'll cover her research. But Thea and I are political engagement project fellows. And so that entails that we take a class called Democracy Lab, which we did last spring. And you essentially have to focus on a project that has to do with democracy and voting in the context, particularly in North Carolina. And Thea and I chose felon voting rights, and we worked with Melissa Crum, who is part of a really amazing organization called North Carolina Voters for Clean Elections. And essentially, her organization was crafting a democracy agenda that they were going to send to politicians, and Thea and I were able to write a portion of that had to do with felon disenfranchisement. And so I'm not sure if anyone watches the show Blackish, but they had an election special this past week, and it really reminded me why I'm passionate about things like this, because it talked a lot about how African Americans have been historically disenfranchised, but have always been willing to rise above and continue to fight for their right to vote. And I think that although felon voting rights are not necessarily solely an African American issue because of mass incarceration, it does affect African Americans disproportionately. And so I think this is a really personal issue to both Thea and myself as Black women. So just for some context, in North Carolina, voting rights are restored upon the completion of one sentence, including prison, parole, and probation. North Carolina is one of 15 states that has this type of felon voting rights restoration law. There are other states where your right to vote is restored as soon as you're released from prison. There are states where you never lose your right to vote, and there are states where you never regain your right to vote. So that's the context of where North Carolina is on that spectrum. This sounds reasonable, but there are a few major problems this creates that Thea and I identified. The first one that I largely focused on is that former felons in North Carolina are required to pay and avoid delinquency on all criminal fines, court fees, supervision fees, and restitution before they can regain their right to vote. And in my belief, conditioning the restoration of voting rights on monetary requirements essentially amounts to wealth-based disenfranchisement. Not to mention the sharp rise of these fees in recent years has made this a super urgent issue. In North Carolina, fees have increased 400% over the past 20 years. Felons can be charged anywhere from $40 to hundreds of dollars a month. The base cost for a court date is $198 with the potential to grow to more than $10,000 in serious cases. If they're unable to pay, they face a penalty fee for non-payment, increasing their fees and lengthening their probation period. So essentially, if you can't pay, you get additional fees tacked on, making it even harder for you to pay. Nearly 2 in 5 people on probation in North Carolina make less than $10,000 a year, for context. So what that means is that for thousands of former felons who have completed all other terms of their sentence and paid their debt to society, they remain on probation and unable to vote simply because they are low income. And essentially, like I said, these fees continue to build up, and it's a vicious cycle of essentially never regaining your right to vote. The ACLU describes this requirement as creating 2 classes of returning citizens, a group wealthy enough to afford their voting rights and another group who can't afford to vote. So this ties into a recommendation that Thea and I had for both of our solutions. So before I talk about the recommendation, Thea's not here, so I'm going to talk about her other aspect, an issue that she identified, and then go into our recommendation. So what Thea was focused on was unintentional voter fraud prosecutions, which is another problem created by current North Carolina voting restoration laws. Essentially, the language within voter disenfranchisement laws is not widely understood or disseminated. Many people get inaccurate information from their probation officers. Many people reported believing that they could vote after probation, while others who were not considered ineligible were told that they could vote. And so essentially what this means is that people are going to the polls because they think that they're done with their probation, they've paid their fines and fees, everything's good, and there's some technicality or something where they're not. And when they try to vote, they're charged with voter fraud and potentially either fined or sent back to jail, which is a serious issue because essentially they're being charged for being misinformed and nothing further. And this disproportionately affects African Americans and Latinx people. So there are specific legislative proposals that could address both of these issues, but Thea and I have thought of a much simpler solution, which is that North Carolina should institute a policy by which voting rights are automatically restored upon release from prison. This would solve all of these problems that we've identified because essentially it would not be contingent on your repayment of fines and fees. There would be no confusion. You know that as soon as you step out of prison, you are eligible to vote and you've repaid your debt to society. This would address many of the complications that we've established, as well as others. And although there may be opposition based on the idea that these individuals don't deserve the right to vote, it's our belief that they've repaid their debt to society once they've served their time and should be immediately reintegrated into the democratic process because this will promote rehabilitation and reduce recidivism, as individuals will feel more connected to their communities and feel like they have a say in how their state and their local community is run. And I'm sorry that Thea wasn't able to be here to share her part, but I hope I did a decent job talking about her aspect of this research. And thank you guys so much.
So thank y'all so much for that. I want to just briefly comment and then maybe ask y'all a couple of questions before the Q&A, if that's okay. So I thought it was really interesting talking about these barriers, how y'all discussed the physical, but also you touched on the psychological aspects being a barrier to voting. And I'm wondering if you could comment or share some insight about that psychological aspect, because while Carlee, you were talking about transportation and that being a physical barrier, I think that the underlying theme I'm understanding is about generations of like lack of promise for our democracy to follow through with these different groups of people. So I'm wondering if you can hint at like how you think that will specifically play a role in this election while y'all are doing such great work trying to provide access. If you think that the motivations and desires to vote are there, and how you think maybe within your own communities or the communities that you're studying that you can prompt that with so much history of disappointment at our electoral process.
Absolutely, I can kick it off. That's absolutely, I mean, this is a systemic issue that's spanning back centuries, and issues where there's a distrust both with the federal government, with local government, with just democracy in general. And that actually plays into the reason why for many people it's so important to vote in person, because you can have faith that you fill something out and you can watch it be counted, as opposed to sending it in the mail and hoping it gets counted in that way. I mean, I think we really focused on, or at least what I kind of talked about, was more so just those physical, actually being able to register and vote. But I did leave out a big part of it, which is the get out the vote campaigns. It's the mobilizing of people. It's the encouraging of people to really vote, because these issues are disproportionately impacting them. So I think a lot of it is this combination of both the physical and that psychological. This is the opportunity for change. It needs to come from us. That there is a difference that can be made. And it's just a matter of ensuring that what is said and promised actually happens.
I can share a quick point in terms of what you're sharing. And yes, I think, generations of not having, that the franchise or not being able to vote, or also, I sometimes like to pose this point to people is like, what is it like for especially like older immigrants who come with their children or have children here to be a person who's stateless, right? Who doesn't know what it means to have rights because they're not within their native state, but also have never received full integration or acceptance into this one, right? It's kind of like a push out that they're trying to make based on the US's immigration policies. And so one example that I've had about that is what it's like to be in rural counties in North Carolina who, you know, don't have the huge proportions of Latinx or Spanish speaking voters, but the youth and their schools are becoming majority or close to majority Hispanics. And those are the people that I was talking about that are aging into like voting age, but like they are in places that don't provide resources in general for their immigrant communities. And then it's like, in some ways they're ostracized to like just not participate in the system because it's such a different setting that they're in. But there's a lot of them in proportion to like the actual county population. So that's very relevant in rural North Carolina.
Yeah, and I'll quickly add that I think that kind of highlights just how important the work that organizations like Untitled Action are doing, because Lauren, you asked about the psychological aspect of it. And, you know, when you feel like you're not being seen and you're not being supported and your family or your communities never have, you don't have that want to participate, right? And an organization like Untitled Action is trying to address that with events and with outreach specifically to Latinx individuals in these communities.
Yeah, I don't know. So just to ask y'all another question about kind of tying also into the history, but in general, when we look at electoral candidates or just your, I guess, thinking about multiple elections that you've seen, whether they be down the ballot or national elections, do you think that with our population becoming increasingly people of color, and these communities, do you see a change in maybe the elected officials wanting to represent these communities more, or do you feel that you're worried about this intensifying, these problems of access intensifying with our growth and change in demographics?
I can go ahead and start answering this. I definitely think that it's scaring some politicians that people of color are increasingly gaining power politically. And so I think that we're seeing a lot more, or I guess different forms of disenfranchisement, whether that's through gerrymandering, different felon voting rights laws, et cetera, like voter ID requirements, like allegations of voting fraud by the president. I think like we're definitely seeing that people are a little bit scared of changing the status quo. And I think that I'm personally concerned about increases in attempts to disenfranchise people of color.
I mean, I can also say too that I think there's an inherent connection too. So in a lot of communities, in the way it's either districted within the county, that there is also, in some cases, either intentional or unintentional ways in which people are, in which county officials have actually prevented communities from electing officials despite having the majority or despite having the numbers to do that. And I think that's especially, given right now the context, issues that need to be addressed and solved, because the desire and drive to represent communities has always been there. I think in the cases, you just need to ensure that there is an ability for those votes to be translated. And when you get to cases where people are disenfranchised and people are prevented from doing it, and it's a very clear problem that needs to be addressed, because that's just a blatant violation of rights, regardless of where you're from or who you are.
Yeah, so that being said, maybe our attendees can, if they would like, send me some questions privately or in the chat. You're welcome to raise your hand as well when we begin the Q&A in about 6 minutes. But just one more question for you all. When you were listening to each other speak about kind of the solutions to these problems, were you thinking about how maybe the solutions that some panelists are tackling could be implemented within your own work? And do you see sort of coalition building as a strategy, or do you feel that these issues are so entrenched and deep that it's important to kind of focus on the single community itself in the work that you do?
That's a great question.
I don't know, it might be a difficult one, but.
Can I offer a quick comment just to maybe help start some thoughts? There is I was just on a panel earlier today, and the story was about how at the local level in one community, and this is in Mecklenburg and Charlotte, a coalition came together around replacing a very pro-deportation sheriff who was a Democrat. And the coalition saw convergence between incarcerating African-American citizens and also unfair treatment to Latinx citizens as well as undocumented people. And this against a Democrat. And they had a primary, this was about 2 years ago, and the reformer won with no money over a well-entrenched incumbent. And so you see a kind of flip. The local sheriff's race was really important. And it was an electoral, just one office, but it raised the prospect of how in a local context, you could have lots of different groups coming together for different reasons, and then learn about their shared interests at the same time. Now, it's a happy story maybe, but I'm wondering whether coalition, maybe just to follow up on Lauren's question about coalition, should it look like, or what do you think it can look like?
I guess I can comment a little bit, and maybe I'm coming at this from a less of a practical specific example that Gunther is mentioning, but I think it touches to the question of like how this is in many ways like it's emotional, it's psychological, and when I hear a lot of the history and stuff that Sydney was sharing, or like when I've listened to a little bit of like what's happening with Florida and the kind of the effort to return that the franchise. I remember there was a presentation or I don't know if it was in high school or early on in college that I saw the numbers of like felons who couldn't vote or were denied the right to vote because of their history, and then in my mind I was like, the number of just undocumented immigrants in the U.S. who have been here for X amount of years. And so as one myself, like, there's kind of this like just gut reaction to saying, I know what that feels like, right? Not having the access to vote. It may be for another reason, but the result is essentially the same, in which is like, I live here, I participate in this society in various ways, and my family does too, but we have no say, right? So I definitely see a lot of parallels in that. I see a lot of learning that's available when you look at those efforts to fight for those rights for them. Like, I could see in the future, how could we then what would be the process of saying, okay, we're going to provide pathways to citizenship, which would just result in like having the right to vote eventually, but like, what would be barriers that would be put up, right? What would be these fines? What would be this return taxes? So I can see kind of like where we would have some opportunity to strategize down the road, and definitely learn from at least right now to prepare for that.
Yeah, I think just to add on, I really agree with everything that Axel said, but also I think that the more people that can vote, that have had that experience of being disenfranchised, the better elected officials will get, and the more legislation we can get in place that will give access to more people to vote. Like, I think it's kind of the cycle of like, the more people we can get in there, then the more people we can get in there, if you know what I mean. Like, I think that all of us kind of have a common goal that we can work towards, which is just getting more people the right to vote and access to the ballot box,
So I want to ask a quick question, and people are starting to place some things in the chat, so please keep filling up the chat. But before we begin the Q&A, one last question for you all is, do you see, like, throughout your work, this being something that is maybe neglectful, as in like unintentional and just a result of like neglecting these communities for so long? Or do you think that it's more systemic and strategic, and how does that impact your the tools that you use to tear down these barriers, whether or not you believe that they're intentional or not?
Yeah, I can start that off, and I think that it's both. I mean, a lot of these issues that Carlee, Sydney, Axel, and I touched on are definitely systemic, but they're also due to neglect. And at least in the work that we've been doing with the Basque Connections class, it's been interesting to try to balance addressing the issue at its root with also trying to make an impact within the next 3 weeks for the election, because, you know, November 3rd is coming and early voting's next week. And it's just like, we want to make the biggest impact now. So don't have an answer to that, but it has been this balance of, all right, we have to make an impact now, elections like coming up, you know, but at the end of the day, like, these issues they're not going to go away if we don't address them at its root level.
I absolutely echo what Anna just said about the fact that it's extremely difficult. I mean, you are addressing, or at least there is a combination of both. I mean, inherently, I think a lot of these do stem from intentional, or at least from very systematic institutions of, you know, racism or discrimination. Unfortunately, I can kind of give you an example. Generally, when there's election funding cuts, the first thing they will do to try to save money is to cut absentee ballot boxes and concentrate a lot of their focus on the areas where there's going to be the most amount of people in order to kind of, you know, get the most bang for their buck, essentially. But the issue when they do that is they essentially make it nearly impossible for people who don't live in that center to access voting. So whether to drop off a ballot or to go in person and vote, that might not be intentional. I'm sure that people who want them to vote don't realize they're doing that, but at the same time, it happens. And for the same reasons that it's difficult to get them a ballot or to have people vote, is the same reason it's difficult to kind of count them in a census, or in order to ensure that they receive the resources they do. So it needs to be considered, because at this point, neglecting isn't, I think, an excuse that works or is applicable anymore, because we know it's there. So you need to find a way to address it.
Yeah, that's awesome. So beginning our Q&A, because we have some eager guests, someone asked that they're curious to hear more about how this experience has colored your perceptions about voting, or more broadly about the American democratic system. What were your expectations coming into the process, and what most surprised you? And has this experience changed your academic or your professional aspirations at all?
One thing that really surprised me was, as I was doing research about different felon voting rights laws, I discovered that Maine and Vermont are the two places where you never lose your right to vote, and felons can actually vote in prison. They have that infrastructure. And I was very curious as to why. And then if you look at demographics, you find that Maine and Vermont are two of the whitest states in America. I think Maine is 97% white, if I'm not mistaken. And that's just hard to believe that that's a coincidence. So it definitely like disappointed me and made me feel a little bit more jaded, especially to find out that places where there's more racial diversity, there's more disenfranchisement. I think I probably should have expected that, but as like a college student, I think I was expecting better from America, and seeing those statistics directly correlated was a bit disappointing for sure.
Real quick, I guess generally based on my experience as an immigrant, I'm pretty like cynical about like this idea of like, oh, you know, we provide freedom, we provide rights, we provide, you know, access to like, you know, partake in this government, because there's obviously so many that don't. But for me, I think one of the highlights has been the potential, right? And like the change is vast, but it's like, how do you organize the the shifting, like just demographics to like, you know, have that access. And so that's been kind of hopeful for me, right? It's like, you know, when I look at who those statistics of the young population is, it includes someone like my sister, right? My youngest sister. It includes someone like those young cousins. And so that's been somewhat reassuring. And it's something that's like energized me to say like, all right, so how can I, you know, within the next 2 or 3, 4 cycles be like, make sure that my sister and then others like her will just be like, see this as the norm, right? And I think that's something that's I've taken out of this. And, you know, we'll see what efforts can result to within the next few weeks, but in the long term, I think that's my vision.
I mean, for me, I think I kind of came at it from the legal perspective because that was how I initially got involved. And I remember starting looking at a lot of these cases, and just these were very like common sense issues. Like the nearest ballot place to vote was 140 miles, like one way through like the mountains in November. And like, they're like, that's just not feasible. So, and just they, in a lot of cases, like all of the lawsuits that are brought against these issues are won because it's very blatant discrimination. So just the fact that this, just from the legal perspective, I mean, the fact that it takes a lawsuit in order to change is extremely disheartening. And I think it's just a little bit of an alarmist because you're now kind of facing a situation where we even have less mobilization than we did before to face it. Was a huge concern for me. And I mean, it's certainly something I think everyone just has to kind of keep your eye on because you're getting to 2020 where you have a presidential election, you have the census coming up. There's just so much compacted in such a small amount of time in circumstances we've never dealt with before.
Yeah, 2020 has definitely been a whirlwind of things, but in terms of legal processes, I definitely understand what you're saying. Sydney, I think you said you're considering law school, and I just took my LSAT on Saturday. So maybe we have that to look forward to, a generation of younger people who have the potential to change our law. That being said, we have about 3 minutes left. So if anyone wants to shoot a last minute question in the Q&A, please feel free to do so. In the meantime, I'm wondering if you can speak on actual electability of the people in your communities, and if you've done any research on that, seen anything about that. I teach a women in politics class, and we've talked a lot about how when people see people who look like them, they're more encouraged to participate in the electoral process. And I'm wondering how these different groups feel about potentially running for office and making that change, or is voting such a barrier in itself that that's not even really a possibility?
Well, real quick, I think it is happening, right? In Durham County, you have about 30%, like close to 30% of the student population is actually Latino, but you don't have that representation across teachers, principals. But then recently there was kind of a wave of effort to get someone who, you know, was at that local office, Latina herself, who could, you know, speak to the community and relate to them. And then one of the exciting thing is that you're having one of the first potential House General Assembly members running for office across in the state here. So that could be another thing. And I have seen, at least within the organizations that are like supporting him, kind of some high energy and saying like, hey, this is, you know, amazing. This is great.
I mean, I can also, there's definitely, I think, I mean, there's a will, there's a way. I mentioned to the organizations, Native Votes in 4 Directions. I mean, there are people even within North Carolina with the Lumbee tribe that are actively seeking out ways in which to ensure people can vote and they have the right to vote. I think there has been an increase in Native Americans being represented in politics, especially in counties where there's a distinct and clear majority. There is, in many cases, there might be repercussions or people trying to push back on that, but there is a very big force for it and a force for change. And with people recognizing these issues, hopefully there is that same push to show that in cases where there is a clear problem with voting, they recognize like that is the impact, that there needs to be people able to represent and reflect their values and their issues.
Can I jump in just real quick? I want to say, I think what's interesting about the crisis and the sense of like fear and dystopia in our politics is that it also is connected to light and a sense that if people are working this hard to stop people from voting, maybe we should vote. There is that sort of built-in opposition. And I do think you see that happening both at the same time. And I think that's what's really interesting, that it's not one or the other, it's both and. And I appreciate the way your work, all of you, grapples with unvarnished assessments of what's wrong, with very strategic opportunities to think about what difference it could make. It is a mobilization problem, no doubt. But anyhow, Lauren, did you want to add or wrap us up?
Yeah, one person had one last question to wrap up, which is, are we all registered to vote, planning to vote? So hopefully the answer is yes.
Yeah, I'll say real quickly that as non-citizens, me and Axel, while we can't vote or register to vote, we are trying our best to mobilize others and make sure that others have or exercise their privilege to vote as well.
I'm registered to vote, and my organization, which is the Anti-Racism Book Club, just took a pledge to make sure that 100% of our eligible members are going to vote. So that's also really exciting. And we're trying to get as many people to vote as we can.
Yeah, that being said, I definitely agree. I'm going to appreciate you sharing that, Anna, because we definitely have a privilege in voting. And that being said, it's our responsibility to exercise that right for people who don't even have that privilege. That being said, I hope that y'all really enjoyed this. I enjoyed having the privilege to speak to you and learn about what you're doing. Please keep up the great work. And I hope that our attendees come back to some more sessions with this awesome set of events going on with POLIS. Thank y'all.
And I just want to say thank you so much. Quick thanks from Paulus to Professor Peck, to Lauren. Thank you so much for moderating. Carlee, Sydney, Anna, Axel. I hope I'm not forgetting anybody. Thea, also. Thank you all for this wonderful research, for the work that you're doing, and for being a part of these conversations and allowing us to learn from you. So on behalf of Paulus, on behalf of Stanford, on behalf of Duke, on behalf of the world, because we need your work. Thank you, and onward. All right. See you all soon. Thank you.